She looked at me with steady eyes and whispered, "I haven't been touched in years." Then, without hesitation, she slipped her hand into mine, and in that moment, everything changed. It was one of those evenings when the city seemed to exhale. The rain had stopped an hour ago, leaving the streets glistening beneath the amber glow of the street lamps. I ducked into the small bookstore café, partly to escape the damp air, partly because I'd grown addicted to the hush inside. The mix of worn pages, muted jazz humming from hidden speakers, and the faint, comforting bitterness of roasted coffee beans. I remember shaking droplets from my jacket and scanning the room for a quiet corner. That's when I saw her. She sat by the wide window, facing the street, a slim porcelain teacup in her hand, her gaze not on the book in front of her, but lost somewhere beyond the glass. The lamplight painted a soft halo around her profile, cheekbones delicate, lips pressed together in thought, strands of chestnut brown hair falling freely against her shoulders. There was something in the way she carried herself, elegant, composed, but beneath it, a stillness that didn't quite feel like peace. Her hand shifted slightly, turning the cup, and I noticed the way her fingers lingered around it, as though she needed the warmth more than the taste. She wasn't just drinking tea. She was holding on to it, like it was the only anchor she had in that quiet space. I told myself to look away. She was older, probably 10, maybe 20 years ahead of me, and far too striking for me to stare without seeming rude. Yet something about her presence tugged at me. It wasn't just attraction, it was recognition. I knew that posture, that air of someone who has spent too long with their own silence. I sat a few tables away, pretending to browse through a book I hadn't even read the title of. My eyes kept drifting back. She was beautiful, yes, graceful in a way that wasn't about youth, but about depth. But what struck me most was the faint shadow of loneliness resting just behind her composure. At one point, she turned a page in the book she hadn't really been reading, and her gaze lifted briefly across the room. Our eyes met, just for a second, a flicker of connection. Her expression didn't change much, but I saw the smallest shift. Her lips softening, the faintest glimmer in her eyes, as though she'd been caught off guard by being seen. I looked down quickly, embarrassed, tracing the same line of text over and over on my page. My heart picked up, not because she had smiled or waved, but because something had passed between us, subtle, almost imperceptible, yet undeniable. The room was filled with the quiet sounds of pages turning, chairs scraping gently against wooden floors, and the steady hiss of the espresso machine. But to me, it felt like the whole place had narrowed to just that window table and the woman who sat there. I didn't know her name. I didn't know her story. All I knew was that, in that moment, she was impossible to ignore. And for reasons I couldn't explain yet, I didn't want to. The second time our eyes met, I didn't look away so quickly. She had shifted in her seat, closing the book she hadn't really been reading, and set it down gently on the table. The motion gave me courage, or maybe an excuse. Either way, I stood up with my own book in hand and walked toward the counter, deliberately passing her table as though I hadn't planned it. She glanced up, polite but reserved, and for a heartbeat, I almost kept walking. Then I noticed the title of the book she had set aside, a classic novel I had read years ago. "That one's heavier than it looks," I said, pausing by her table. My tone was casual, not too forward, but my chest tightened as I waited for her response. For the briefest moment, she hesitated. Then she smiled, small, careful, the kind of smile that tests whether it's safe to stay open. "It is," she agreed, her voice low and steady. "I've read it before, but sometimes I come back to it. It feels different every few years." I nodded, shifting the book in my hand. "I know what you mean. Some stories grow with you." Something softened in her eyes. She gestured lightly to the empty chair across from her, a wordless invitation. I sat down, trying not to look as surprised as I felt. The cafe seemed to fade as we began to talk. Our conversation wasn't forced, and that surprised me. Usually, introductions feel like climbing over walls, but with her, it was as though the walls had already been lowered. We spoke of books first, then drifted into small fragments of life. How the city feels quieter at night, how the rain seems to cleanse more than just the streets. She listened intently, her chin resting lightly in her hand, eyes steady on me, as though she was considering not just my words but the spaces between them. At one point, she reached for the book in front of me. "May I?" she asked, and before I could answer, her fingers brushed against mine as she slid it closer. The contact was brief, accidental perhaps, but stayed with me long after. Her touch was warm, not in the obvious physical sense, but in the way it seemed to linger beneath my skin, leaving a trace of something alive. She noticed too. I saw it in the way her eyes flickered down for a moment, the faint catch in her breath. Yet she didn't withdraw. Instead, she turned the book over in her hands, smiling faintly. I found myself leaning forward, elbows resting on the table, listening more closely than I usually do. She had a way of speaking that carried both confidence and restraint, as though every word she gave me was carefully chosen, but still genuine. And somewhere in that exchange, the brush of her hand, the warmth of her voice, the quiet understanding that needed no explanation, I felt the ground shift. What began as a casual remark about a book was becoming something else, something neither of us had named yet, but both of us could feel. That evening, the rain outside turned the world into a quiet, silver canvas. I offered to walk her home, and she accepted, with a small nod, as though granting permission rather than asking a favor. The umbrellas came out, and we stepped into the soft patter of droplets. The cafe's warmth lingered on our shoulders, but the night air carried its own magic, cool, cleansing, and strangely intimate. We walked side by side. My hand hovered near hers, but I held back, purposefully, politely. Every so often, she glanced at me, her expression pensive, as if she were weighing whether to speak or save the moment for later. The hush between us felt charged, meaning-packed in the spaces where words hadn't yet been spoken. Our pace slowed under a street lamp whose light fractured across the wet pavement. Here, the world contracted. The hum of distant traffic, the lull of rain on rooftops, and just us. Then, softly, she broke the silence. "I haven't been touched in years." The words came out in a whisper, and my breath caught. She stared at the lamplight, not at me, her eyes fixed on the golden circle right in front of her, as though it held answers she didn't trust. Her voice trembled slightly, the kind of tremor that spoke of nights spent alone, of reclamation deferred, of longing dulled by time. For a moment, I didn't move. The weight of her vulnerability hung between us tender and fragile. The world felt suspended. Then, quietly and almost unconsciously, she reached for my hand. There was no hesitation in the move, just a gentle grace, her fingers finding mine with intuitive precision. Her skin was cool, but the gesture felt warm, urgent, and reverent all at once. I felt her tendons shift subtly against my palm as she braced herself on the edge of exposure. My fingers curved around hers, lightly, almost dreamily. Plugging in her touch felt electric, but in the softest sense. A spark, yes, but one grounded in real, human need. I sensed her breath even before she inhaled again, held shallow and hopeful. "I didn't mean to say that," she murmured, as though regret could retract the truth she'd revealed. Her gaze shifted to our joined hands, fingers interlaced, knuckles grazing the rain's reflection. Her mouth curved into a faint, uncertain smile, like a soft apology. Vulnerability isn't elegant. It's unadorned. It trembles with rawness. And there it was, unvarnished, beautiful, honest. I lifted my eyes to hers, and the world tilted. The lamplight illuminated her face, the slight quiver of her lashes, the delicate curve at her temples, the nearly invisible tremor of her jaw. I wanted to say something that mattered, something that would soften the aching inside her. But my voice felt small, awkward. Instead, I offered what I could. "You don't have to feel alone anymore." She exhaled, just a sigh, yet seemed to ease the tension in her shoulders. In that moment, hand in hand under rain-kissed light, something unspoken passed between us. It wasn't a declaration, not yet, but the admission, and the response opened a door. All around us, the night continued, indifferent and still beautiful. And inside that opening, I sensed the beginning of something quiet, true, and tender. A promise that we would slowly, gently learn how to touch each other again. We walked on, still hand in hand, the umbrella tilted just enough to cover us both. Rain tapped softly against the fabric above us, a steady rhythm that seemed to underline every step we took. The city felt hushed, streets slick with reflections, shop signs shimmering on the wet pavement, headlights bending into long streaks of light. Her shoulder brushed mine as we moved closer beneath the umbrella. It was such a small contact, but it echoed through me like a hidden chord being struck. I could feel the weight of her presence, her warmth, her fragrance mingling with the damp night air. There was something delicate about the way she leaned ever so slightly toward me, as if allowing herself to occupy that space without fully admitting it. Neither of us spoke for a while. Words would have felt too heavy, too deliberate. Instead, we let silence carry us, each step a quiet negotiation of closeness and restraint. I noticed how her thumb shifted against my hand occasionally, tracing the faintest, unconscious pattern. It wasn't bold. It wasn't accidental either. It was something in between, like she was reminding herself that this connection was real, alive in her grasp. I stole a glance at her. Her gaze was fixed forward, but her lips were parted slightly, her brow furrowed in a way that spoke of thought, maybe conflict. She was a woman who knew herself, who carried history in the lines of her expression. And yet, in that moment, I sensed her hesitation. Not because she didn't want this, but because she did. I tightened my hand around hers, just enough to say, "I'm here. I won't let go." That was when she looked up at me. Not a quick glance, not casual. Her eyes found mine and stayed. The rain dimmed, the world quieted, and all I could hear was the rush of my own pulse. There was no smile on her lips, no easy expression to soften what she was feeling. It was raw, direct, an unspoken admission that neither of us knew how to put into words. Her gaze lingered long enough that I felt my breath catch. I wanted to tell her that she was beautiful, that she didn't need to be afraid of being wanted, that her hand in mine felt like the most natural thing in the world. But instead, I just held her eyes, letting silence carry the weight of what we couldn't yet say aloud. Eventually, she blinked, her lashes damp from the drizzle, clinging to the air. She exhaled softly, almost like she'd been holding her breath. Her grip on my hand tightened, and we resumed walking, a little closer now, shoulders brushing with each step. There was no declaration, no kiss beneath the rain, nothing dramatic. Just the quiet recognition that something fragile and powerful was unfolding between us. The tension was real, undeniable. But it was also tender, like the pause before music begins, the breath before confession, the space where two hearts learn to move in rhythm. And in that fragile pause, I knew, whatever this was, it was only just beginning. The rain had eased by the time we reached the park. The world smelled fresh, the air sharp with the scent of wet grass and damp earth. A bench stood beneath a sprawling tree, its branches heavy with dripping leaves. She paused there, her hand still in mine, then let out a quiet breath, as though she'd been carrying something for too long. "Let's sit," she said softly. We sank onto the bench side by side, our knees almost touching. The world around us was hushed. The only sounds the faint drip of rainwater sliding from leaf to leaf and the occasional car whispering by in the distance. She leaned back against the cool wood, her shoulders sinking a little, like she was allowing herself to rest in a way she hadn't in a long time. For a while, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't empty, though it felt like the kind of space that invited truth. I could sense something circling in her, something she wanted to share, but was afraid of voicing aloud. I waited, not pushing, just keeping her hand gently in mine. Finally, she turned her head, her profile outlined by the glow of a street lamp across the path. Her voice was low, careful. "You don't know how strange this feels. To sit here with you, holding your hand. Part of me is terrified someone will see us. Part of me," she hesitated, her lips pressing together. "Part of me doesn't care." Her honesty landed between us, heavier than the rain had been. I felt the tremor in her words, the fear that threaded through them. I shifted slightly toward her, meeting her gaze. "Why terrified?" I asked gently. She gave a small, humorless laugh. "Because people don't forgive women like me. They'll call me foolish, desperate, clinging to something I have no right to want. And maybe they're right. Maybe I should know better." Her eyes glistened in the dim light, though no tears fell. She wasn't breaking. She was bearing herself, raw and unguarded. I lifted my free hand and brushed a damp strand of hair from her cheek. My knuckles grazed her skin, and the softness of the touch made her eyes flutter, closed for a heartbeat. "I don't see foolish," I said quietly. "I see someone who's strong, someone who's been carrying silence for too long. And if being here with me feels wrong to the world, then let the world be wrong." She exhaled slowly, her lips parting as though she'd been holding her breath. The tension in her shoulders eased just a little, and she let her head tilt back against the bench. For the first time, I saw her let go of that careful control she wore like armor. Her hand squeezed mine, not seeking reassurance this time, but giving it. "I don't know why," she whispered, "but I believe you." And sitting there, under the dripping branches with her warmth pressed against me, I realized it wasn't about convincing her she could trust me. It was about showing her, moment by moment, that she wasn't alone anymore. The night stretched on, and by the time we reached my apartment, the city had fallen into its softer rhythm. Street lamps cast long shadows across the pavement, and the air hummed faintly with distant traffic. I unlocked the door, feeling a flicker of hesitation. Inviting her in felt momentous, though the gesture was simple. She stepped inside slowly, her eyes drifting over the space. My place was small. An old couch, shelves lined with books, a lamp casting warm light against the walls. Nothing remarkable, but she smiled faintly, almost as if relieved by its simplicity. "It feels safe," she murmured, setting her damp umbrella by the door. I busied myself for a moment, pouring glasses of water, giving her space. She sat down on the couch, smoothing the fabric of her dress across her knees. The way she perched there, graceful yet uncertain, made my chest tighten. I joined her, leaving just enough space to be respectful, but not distant. For a while we simply talked. I told her a story from my childhood, something light, a memory about sneaking books under my blanket with a flashlight. She laughed softly, the sound low and warm, filling the room in a way that made it feel alive. Her laughter faded, leaving a hush between us. She looked at me, then really looked, and the weight of her gaze lingered. My knee brushed hers. Neither of us shifted away. She exhaled, a slow breath that trembled slightly, and leaned just a little closer. The distance between us thinned, charged with quiet energy. Her shoulder pressed gently against mine. I could feel her warmth through the thin barrier of fabric, and the contact stirred something deep, both tender and protective. When her head, lowered to rest against my shoulder, wasn't tentative, it was deliberate, though laced with vulnerability. Her hair brushed my jaw, carrying a faint scent of rain and something subtle, like jasmine. My pulse quickened, but I didn't move. I simply let her weight settle against me, honoring the trust in her choice. Her hand shifted then, resting lightly on my chest. The touch was barely there, fingertips grazing my shirt as though testing whether I'd allow it. I placed my hand over hers, gently enclosing it. Through that contact, I could feel her heartbeat, a steady rhythm, yet a little faster than before. Neither of us spoke. Words would have broken the spell, reduced the moment to something smaller than it was. Instead, I let the silence hold us, my cheek brushing lightly against her hair. I realized then that this wasn't about a kiss or a confession. It was about permission, the quiet, unspoken decision to lean into something we both felt but hadn't dared name. She sighed against me, a sound so soft it might have been mistaken for breath. I don't remember the last time I felt this. Her words trailed off, unfinished, but I understood. I tightened my arm slightly around her shoulders, a silent answer. Whatever this was, however fragile, it was real. And in that moment, it felt like the beginning of something worth protecting. The night had deepened, pressing softly against the windows, but in the quiet glow of the lamp, time felt suspended. She hadn't moved from where she rested, her head against my shoulder, her hand still beneath mine on my chest. It was such a simple arrangement, yet it carried more weight than anything I had felt in years. Her breathing had slowed, steady now, like she had finally allowed herself to exhale after holding it for far too long. I traced the curve of her knuckles gently with my thumb, not to stir her, but to remind her, wordlessly, that I was there. She noticed. I felt the smallest squeeze in return, subtle but deliberate, as though she was saying, "Don't let go." After a while, she shifted slightly, lifting her head. Her eyes met mine, and in that closeness, the room seemed to grow impossibly quiet. There was no mask on her face now, no guarded composure. Just openness, raw and unadorned. "It feels good," she whispered, her voice almost fragile, "to be seen again." The words struck something deep in me. I could hear the years behind them, the loneliness, the silence, the ache she had carried without complaint. I lifted my free hand, brushing my fingertips along her cheek. Her skin was warm beneath my touch, and she leaned into it instinctively, as though starved for such tenderness. "I see you," I said softly. "All of you. And I'm not going anywhere." Her eyes softened, shimmering in the lamplight. She didn't reply right away. Instead, she leaned closer, and I felt the brief brush of her lips against my cheek. It wasn't hurried, wasn't meant to ignite flames. It was a seal, a gesture of quiet trust. Her breath lingered against my skin for a moment before she pulled back, her expression vulnerable yet steady. That small kiss said more than any declaration could. It was permission, it was hope, it was the acknowledgement that despite the years, despite the doubts, she was willing to let herself be held again. I slid my arm around her, drawing her against me. She rested her head on my chest this time, her cheek over my heartbeat. I could feel her relax into the rhythm, letting the steadiness ground her. And for me, holding her like that filled a hollow I hadn't even realized I carried. The city outside went on without us, cars passing, lights flickering, the world turning. But in that room, on that couch, everything else faded. There was only the weight of her against me, the quiet warmth of her trust, and the fragile but undeniable truth that what had begun in silence now had the promise of something lasting. Not a fairy tale, not fireworks, just the kind of love that begins in the quietest of moments, born from honesty, nurtured by touch, and built on the simple, profound relief of no longer being alone. And as she drifted against me, her hand still held in mine, I knew I would spend however long it took proving those words true. "I see you. I'm not going anywhere."